Welcome back to our lectures. So I've entitled today's lecture British North America, Conflict and Cooperation. And I've called it that because we're going to be looking at the last couple decades of the 1600s, really 1675 until about 1700 or so, which is really indeed decades of both conflict and cooperation. It's a decade of a lot of growth for the British North American colonies, but it's also the source of a lot of conflict. And the first conflict I want us to talk about, which we're going to take a look at on the next screen, is King Philip's War. All right, so King Philip's War was basically a war in the New England colonies between the English colonists and several of the local indigenous tribes that had survived the wave of disease that Europeans had brought with them. So what had happened, of course, is that as more and more settlers come to New England, they are pushing ever further into Indian land. And of course, the Indians need that land in order to survive. So in 1675, the surviving indigenous groups got together and they created an alliance. And their alliance then attacked English settlers. The idea was that they could drive the English off of indigenous lands once and for all. Now, the English named the Wampanoag leader Metacom as the head bad guy, as the person behind all of this. They called Metacom King Philip, and that's how we get the term King Philip's War. However, Metacom was really only leading the Wampanoags. All of the other indigenous groups that were involved were led by their own leaders. So even though we call it King Philip's War, that's a little bit of a misnomer. King Philip Metacom just happens to be the person that the English blamed. So 12 towns in Massachusetts are completely destroyed in attacks. These are English towns that are completely destroyed. And very quickly it becomes a very bloody conflict on both sides. So you have Indians attacking settlers, settlers attacking Indians. It becomes very bloody on both sides. It's been estimated that about 1,000 English settlers, and remember there's only 52,000 of them to begin with, about 1,000 English settlers are killed in the war. And about another 3,000 indigenous peoples out of a population of probably by then only about 20,000 in New England die in the fighting. And in fact, not only are people killed in the fighting, but in fact, a lot of people are taken as hostages, are taken as ransom. And in fact, for many decades, New England families will be trying to recover loved ones who had been taken as really prizes of war in the conflict. Now, in 1676, the English are able to get the upper hand because what they do is they enlist the Iroquois on their side. And you remember we've talked about the Iroquois before. They're a very powerful confederacy living largely in what's today New York. So the Iroquois join the war, but they join it to fight on the side of the English, and ultimately with the combined forces of the English and the Iroquois, very quickly the war is brought to an end. The English are able to sort of crush the remaining resistance. And Metacom is killed, so Metacom is no longer a threat to the English. The English then destroy several Indian villages, so you see this is retaliation on both sides. And in fact, a lot of the surviving indigenous peoples from the area, if they are not killed in the final phase of the war, they are then sold into slavery in the Caribbean. So not only are they sold into slavery, but they're sold into slavery thousands of miles from home, with it understood that most likely they would die in the Caribbean. So extremely harsh punishment for daring to have risen up against the English. So this war is very, very vicious on both sides. But for the English in particular, they will remember King Philip's War for generations. They will remember King Philip's War, and they will think of indigenous peoples as particularly savage. And again, there was plenty of savagery on both sides, but the English in particular will point this out as a moment that sort of shows just how savage indigenous peoples could be. For us, looking at this period in history, it's also important because if you look at King Philip's War on the one hand and Bacon's Rebellion on the other, which we talked about last time, these are both, I think, signs of the ongoing instability in Britain's North American colonies. So again, conflict, cooperation. It's a period of growth, but it's a period of tremendous, tremendous instability. Now, it's not just unstable in the colonies, it's unstable back in England as well. And in fact, in many ways, the instability in England is what's contributing to some of the instability in the North American colonies. If you know your British history, this is a period referred to as the Glorious Revolution. What had happened was the English King James II had died. He was succeeded on the throne by his brother King James II. Now, unlike Charles, though, King James II was Catholic. And so the British, and particularly the British nobility, who are all Protestant, are not happy about having a Catholic king on the throne. So ultimately what they decide to do is to force James off the throne in favor of James's daughter, Mary. Mary is a Protestant, and in fact she had married a Dutch nobleman who was also a Protestant, a man by the name of William of Orange. So this is the famous William and Mary. And so King James II is pushed off the throne. It's a bloodless revolution. That's why they call it the Glorious Revolution, because this time nobody actually lost their head. But the king is forced off the throne. He's forced to flee England, and Mary and her husband William now take the throne of England as Protestant monarchs. So this is a period really that reestablishes that England will be a Protestant nation. And it's also a period where increasingly you're seeing the British people, or at least the nobility, who of course control Parliament, reasserting their rights. So for example, in the wake of the Glorious Revolution in 1689, they passed the English Bill of Rights, and it's the first written Bill of Rights that England has. And it's not perhaps a Bill of Rights the way we would recognize, sort of the one we have in our Constitution, but for 1689, it's a pretty forward-thinking document. It does things, for example, like guarantee the right to trial by jury if someone is accused of a crime. That's, of course, very, very important. So the king just can't randomly decide what to do with somebody. They have to be tried by jury. It also clarifies some of the powers of Parliament. So, for example, the English Bill of Rights says that it is Parliament and not the king or queen who makes decisions about taxation. Again, very, very important in terms of who has power in the English system. And so basically, the reason this is worth remembering, I think, is this is really when the king or the queen of England is no longer the supreme ruler. Right? Even the ruler of England is now subject to the rule of law, just like everybody else is. Power is going to have to be shared. It's going to have to be shared between the English monarch and Parliament. And it sort of establishes, at least on a very basic level, that individuals do have rights, even if they're not perhaps the kind of rights that we are used to enjoying. And these are, of course, all ideas that are going to have very long-term implications in the American colonies. Almost immediately, all of this change taking place in England does begin to change some of the power relationships in the colonies, as you might expect. It begins to shake things up and mix things up. For example, I'll just give you one example. This newly revived sort of English government decides that they are going to reorganize the British colonies in New England. So in 1691, they take the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony, which up until this point had been separate, and they combined them into one colony. They weren't asked. This was simply something England decided to do. At the same time, England also demanded that the Massachusetts colony abide by the English Toleration Act of 1690. And that was an act England had passed that basically said that England would tolerate the presence of other Protestant religions. Remember that England has an established church. They call it the Church of England. Here we call it the Anglican Church, but it's an established church. And after many, many decades of fighting, England in 1690 had passed a law saying, all right, we will tolerate other Protestant religions. Keep in mind, this is obviously not tolerating Catholics, certainly not tolerating Jews or Muslims, but at least they're going to tolerate folks like the Puritans, the Quakers, some of the other groups that we've talked about. So now, with this reorganization of the Massachusetts colony, England says, okay, Massachusetts, we know in the past you've persecuted people like the Quakers. You can't do that anymore. From now on, you have to tolerate the presence of other Protestant religions in your colony just the way the other colonies do. And you can imagine the Puritans were not at all happy about this, right? It's sort of, for them, it was always all about maintaining it as a Puritan colony. And so this will be something actually that causes a huge amount of stress in the Massachusetts Bay Colony as we move into the later part of the 1600s. All right. Now, of course, if we're talking about instability in the British North American colonies, I think undoubtedly the most famous episode of that is the Salem witch trials. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time talking specifically about the Salem witch trials, but really putting them in this larger context of some of the problems of the late 1600s, early 1700s in these colonies. Because again, if you're looking for an example of that something has gone wrong, persecuting people as witches is usually, I think, a pretty good example that yes, things have indeed gone wrong. So a little bit of background here. So just as a reminder, between King Philip's War and then all of these changes that England had been forcing on the Massachusetts colony, by the time you get to the 1690s, Massachusetts is already under a tremendous amount of psychological strain. They're increasingly having changes forced on them, and these are changes that they're not adapting to very well. Remember, the Puritans had this vision for what they wanted their colony to be, and by the 1690s, that's not what the colony is anymore. Okay. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that even though, yes, the Puritans were very, very religious people, they were also people of their time. And by that, I mean, in the 1600s, pretty much anywhere you went in Europe or in the American colonies, people believed in a lot of things that today we consider superstition. They believed in fortune telling. They believed in astrology. They believed in magic. And yes, they believed in witches. Witches were very real to Europeans in the 1600s. In fact, as you have probably heard, between 1400 and 1800, it's been estimated that 50,000 people in Europe were executed for allegedly being witches. Most often, at least in Europe, burned at the stake. Now, I say allegedly because, of course, that's the tricky thing about accusing people of being witches. It's almost impossible to prove you're not a witch. It's very hard to prove a negative. If someone says to you, you're a frog, how do you prove you're not a frog? It's very hard to prove a negative. So were these people actually witches? I don't really think that's the important part of this question. That's a question we can't really answer. But I think more importantly, these are people who had no right to a trial, no right to a jury of their peers. They were simply accused of practicing witchcraft and executed. And of course, these are ideas that are brought by Europeans to the North American colony. It's also important to note that these superstitions serve a very important function for people in the 1600s. And that is, it's a very convenient way of explaining when terrible things happen. So when crops fail, or your cow can no longer give milk, or heaven forbid a child dies, witches are a very convenient explanation for why things go wrong. And I think that's one of the reasons accusations of witchcraft go on for so many centuries. Now, in New England, there had been episodes of having accused witches executed even before Salem. Okay, they're relatively rare, but you do see one or two of them here or there. And the main difference between what happens in Europe and what happens in the North American colonies is that in Europe, witches are generally burned. Of course, by the late 1600s, particularly in the colonies, they are hanged. So none of the American witches are ever burned at the stake. That's strictly a sort of medieval European thing. But in any event, you're still executed, and you're still executed without any jury. Any sentence. You are simply accused. The court decides you're guilty and you are summarily executed. But again, it had been pretty rare until you get to Salem in 1692. Now, Salem was actually a village. It's called Salem Village as opposed to Salem Town. They were right next to each other outside of what's today Boston, Massachusetts. If you're curious, Salem Village today is technically the city of Danvers, Massachusetts. But in any case, we're talking about Salem Village, not Salem Town. Okay, so here's the story. In spring of 1692, in the home of a reverend by the name of Samuel Parris, a group of girls started having nightmares. They started convulsing. They started having fits. Something was very wrong with these young girls. And so, of course, the parents want to know what's wrong, and the girls insist that they are being tormented by witches. That is who is causing their suffering. Now, allegedly, the girls had been experimenting with fortune telling before this whole thing happened, so maybe that was where they got the idea. But nonetheless, of course, when they tell their parents that it is witches who are tormenting them, the parents understandably want to know who the witches are. So, for example, one of the first people the girls point to is a Caribbean woman, an Indian woman by the name of Tituba, who was enslaved in the home of Samuel Parris. And she's the first of 3 women that these girls point to and say, yes, that's the witch, that's the person causing our suffering. So, of course, immediately the community investigates. They begin to arrest people. They begin to try people to try to get to the bottom of this outbreak of witchcraft. And by the summer, you have hundreds of people being accused. Very quickly, this spreads beyond the Paris home and all over the community. People are seemingly turning on each other, pointing fingers at neighbors, at some cases even at relatives. So by the summer of 1692, we have 200 people in this still very small town of Salem Village who had been accused of being witches, 3/4 of them being women, which we will come back to in a minute. And basically, when you're an accused witch in 1692 New England, you really only have 2 options because, again, you can't prove your innocence against an accusation like witchcraft. Option number 1 is to confess. Whether you're guilty or not, you can confess. A lot of times that's at least enough to save your life, so some people do that. But of course, some people refuse to confess to something they didn't do. And so ultimately, 20 people are executed in the Salem witch trials. Again, 3/4 of them are women. And then another 5 of them die in jail. Jails are extremely unsanitary places in this time period. They're also very, very cold because this is New England. So 5 people actually get ill and die in jail. So you have quite a number of people who ultimately die in this hysteria. Now, by the fall, the authorities in Massachusetts, particularly back in Boston, which is a much, much larger community, realized something has gone very wrong, that this has gone beyond just a witch or 2, and this has somehow turned into some sort of mass movement. And so authorities in Boston insist that the Salem court be dissolved, that whatever had gone wrong, the court could not keep prosecuting people. And so they dissolved the court in Salem and they ordered the release of the remaining prisoners. And so that's basically the end of the Salem witch trials, right? It's basically been now shut down. But again, for us as historians, and you're a historian because you're taking this class, I think the much more interesting question is what exactly happened here and who got victimized in it and why? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. All right. So even at the time it happened, Salem was very, very famous. One of the judges who had prosecuted a lot of the witches, named Cotton Mather, actually wrote a book, and you see the front cover of that book here. It's called The Wonders of the Invisible World, being an account of the trials of several witches lately executed in New England, and several remarkable curiosities therein occurring. Cotton Mather, by the way, very strongly believed that these were indeed witches, so this is very much a book talking about, yes, there were witches and we executed them. But nonetheless, it's very famous. So almost from the moment the Salem witch hysteria ended, we've been trying to figure out what exactly happened. And depending on which historian you believe, there's a lot of different theories out there. And I'm not going to tell you which one to believe, I'm just going to sort of walk you through them. So, the first theory is that this was some kind of mass religious-induced hysteria. Remember that Puritans have a very strict religion, right? You're either saved or damned, and you can never know which one it is. It's a very harsh religion. It's a very intolerant religion. And also keep in mind that recently England had forced Massachusetts to accept the presence of other Protestant denominations. So it could be that all of this kind of snowballed into basically religious hysteria, and that's what triggered all of these accusations of witchcraft. Biologists have come up with another possible explanation, and that is what's called ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on grain, and it usually happens when you've had particularly rainy weather. There have been documented cases of ergot poisoning in human history. I think the last one was actually in the 1950s in France. You can Google it if you want to look into that. But this theory goes that perhaps there had been unintentional ergot poisoning of the community in Salem Village, that the grain had been infected with this mold, people ate the grain, and people got sick. And the reason that this might fit is that one of the main symptoms of ergot poisoning is it causes hallucinations. Ergot works on the human body somewhat like LSD does. So it can cause hallucinations. It can also cause things like convulsions. So at least from a biological standpoint, it's not perhaps a bad explanation. Again, we can't prove it, but it's an interesting idea that perhaps these people had been unintentionally poisoned. Keeping along the lines of this being perhaps related to illness, another theory is that there was an outbreak of a disease called encephalitis. Encephalitis is an illness of the brain. It actually causes swelling of the brain. And actually, if your brain is swollen, again, one of the signs of that is going to be hallucinations and irrationality. So it could be that if there was an outbreak of encephalitis in this community, that would also perhaps explain sort of the level of hysteria. On a more practical level, another theory that's been floated by historians is that this could have just been about money. This could have just been economic jealousy among neighbors, that perhaps your neighbor had a bigger house, or he had more cows, or she had more money than you did, and that perhaps accusing that person of being a witch and perhaps getting them executed, because if you were executed, you forfeited what you owned to the government because you were dead anyway. So perhaps this was economic jealousy. This was a way to punish neighbors that you were jealous of because they had more than you, and maybe get your hands on their stuff once they're executed. So perhaps there may have been an economic motive behind all of this. And then just sort of the larger possibility that this was just social stress, that this was a community that was just on edge, and in 1692 they just tipped over the edge. Remember, we've talked about King Philip's War, which would have been in the living memory of all of the people in Salem. They very likely would have known people who were died or captured in King Philip's War. England has been forcing all these changes on them. They are in a religious system that's very sort of rigid and oppressive, at least by modern standards. So maybe the whole community just snapped, right? So again, one of the interesting things about history is we can't always know exactly what happened or why it happened, but I think these are all interesting theories. And I think perhaps you can sort of, if you're interested, explore each of these on their own and sort of decide for yourself what ultimately you think happened. But again, I think as historians, what caused it is interesting to speculate about. But I think what's particularly interesting to speculate about, at least for me, is why were so many of the people accused and so many of the people executed women? And so that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide. Oh, I forgot about this, but I've actually been to Salem. I was at a conference in Boston, long story. But anyway, this is actually the monument that's in modern-day Salem, Massachusetts, to those people who were executed. Most of their bodies were probably buried in unmarked graves, so we don't have their graves. So instead, the community built this monument to them. And so what it is basically you walk into the area, and then there's a stone seat with the names of each of the executed, as well as how they died and when they died. Right, and it's really quite a powerful little monument that they have. And in addition to these benches, which have the names of the victims on it, in the pavement, as you walk around, there's quotes taken actually from the trial transcripts of different people protesting during their trials. So things like, "Oh Lord, help me," or "God knows I am innocent," or "I am wholly innocent of such wickedness." Those are engraved into the stones as you walk around. So as you probably know, modern-day Salem, Massachusetts has kind of built a whole industry around the Salem witch trials, a lot of which is, very touristy. But they do have this very, I think, dignified monument acknowledging the lives that were lost in the Salem witch trial. Okay, so this is the part that I wanted us to go back to, and that, again, is that three-quarters statistic. 3/4 of the people accused are women, 3/4 of the people executed are women. What can history perhaps tell us about why that might have been? So historians have done statistical analysis of the people who were arrested, prosecuted, and executed in Salem. And they found, in addition to being women, they also tended to have a couple of other things in common. They tended to be older. They tended to be women beyond childbearing age. So there were women in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right? They were beyond menopause. And this, of course, would have been very important because, remember, in a community like Salem, Your value as a woman lay in being able to have children, right? Children was critical to the survival of the community. Most of the women who get accused in Salem are beyond childbearing age, so perhaps these were women who were already seen as not being particularly valuable anymore. They were also all women who were known to be outspoken in the community, or they had somehow antagonized people. Either they talked too much, or they insulted people, or they were perhaps mentally ill. But these were all accusers who in some way, shape, or form sort of stuck out in Salem Village. And again, sticking out is not something you want to do in a Puritan community. A lot of them were actually economically independent. A lot of them were women who did have a fair amount of money. Which again, if we believe the economic jealousy theory, that perhaps is at work here. And also, and I think this is very important, most of them were either widowed or estranged from their husbands, or in some other way violated the gender norms of the day. Because again, in a community like a Protestant, in this case specifically a Puritan village, women are expected to behave in a certain way, and they are expected to be deferential to men. And so women who are seen as being independent men, and particularly women who, quote unquote, don't behave themselves, I think we can easily see how they might have been the first ones who get targeted. So again, sort of combining the theories that we talked about with this statistical analysis that's been done, it could be that there was something going on here in terms of money and power and envy and perhaps even inheritance. Because, for example, in the British North American colonies, when a man died, his possessions always went to his eldest son by law. But a woman did have what were called dower rights, which meant that she was given a portion of the estate to live on until she passed away. Okay. Now imagine for a minute you had a stepmother that you didn't like. You were perhaps struggling in your life, you were a farmer, you were having a hard time making it, and you see that your stepmother, who you never liked anyway, has dower rights to the remainder of your father's estate. Could you perhaps not want to get your hands on that money by perhaps removing your stepmother from the equation? Now, of course, we can't prove any of this, but the statistical analysis does tell us that most of the people accused are widows, and most of them are people or estranged from their husbands, and most of them are women who did have money. So it could very well be that these were ways to remove women who were seen as inconvenient and perhaps get your hands on what they possessed. This is also reinforced by another interesting statistic, which is that 89% of the women who ultimately get executed don't even have a brother or a son. So a woman might be widowed, which is a mark against her, but what seems to have particularly pushed her over into ultimately being someone that got executed was if there was no man at all to speak for her, not even a brother or a son, because again, the authority that's respected in a Puritan village like Salem Village is male authority. And male authority could go a long way in potentially protecting you from accusations of witchcraft, and a lot of the victims simply did not have that. So again, just some interesting things to think about in terms of contextualizing the Salem witch trials, in terms of what's going on in the larger world around it, right? Things like this don't happen by accident, and they don't happen in a vacuum. So think of this as being sort of the clearest case for just how much conflict is stirring in these British North American colonies by the late 1600s. Okay, so moving on to slightly more cheerful events. This is, as I also said, though, not just an era of conflict, it's also an era of growth and of cooperation. So by the time we get to the late 1600s and we start to move into the 1700s, what we call the 18th century, we are seeing a lot of growth in the North American colonies. One of the most interesting changes is that back in the early 1600s, these colonies had been largely divided, right? Particularly in the South. There were the elites who owned the land, and then there were the indentured servants and the slaves, and there wasn't really anybody in between. That's beginning to change as you get into the 18th century. You have a growing population of craftsmen and professionals, teachers, ministers, carpenters, weavers, candle makers. Today, of course, we'd probably call these folks middle class, That's not a concept that existed in the 18th century. Marx will come up with that in the 19th century, but I think for right now we can sort of use that term. This is the creation of a middle class in the British North American colonies that it didn't have before. So now instead of just having sort of the elites and the very poor, you are getting sort of a middle class in between the two. The population's also getting more diverse. One of the really interesting debates in this time period is, what do you do when people who are not English want to come to the British North American colonies, right? I mean, yes, they had taken over New Amsterdam and made it New York, so there were a few Dutch people already there. But what's happening is there's a new wave of migration coming, in this case, from the German states. Germany in the 18th century is not a single country, it's several principalities. But there was a big problem with religious intoleration in those German states. Either the state was Catholic and they didn't tolerate Protestants, or the state was Protestant and it didn't tolerate Catholic. In any event, you begin to see a lot of Germans leaving the German states to come to British North America, specifically in pursuit of religious freedom. And most of them end up in what's today Pennsylvania and New York, 85,000 of them. So it's a pretty big migration. And in fact, as you read in one of the assigned documents, this sparks actually the first quote-unquote immigration debate in what eventually becomes the United States. They don't use the term immigration, by the way, but it's a whole debate about, whoa, we don't know if we want these people here. They speak a different language. They look a little bit different. We're not entirely sure it's a good thing to have these people here. What if they take our jobs? Again, it's really interesting how the threads of debates about the presence of people who are not like you repeat themselves, and it really sort of starts with the debate over Germans. Ultimately, of course, the Germans are allowed to stay, and in fact, there are many, many millions of people now in the United States who have in some part German ancestry. But again, think about that. Think about how worrisome it is for this community that had been mostly English to now suddenly have 85,000 Germans living among them, of course, who spoke German as their first language. Now, in addition to the arrival of new waves of immigrants from Europe, obviously there's also expansion going on, right? There's only so much land to go around, so people who need more land, they begin to start to push to the west of the existing colonies. And we refer to that collectively as the back country. And you see it on a map here. So it's sort of western Pennsylvania, western New York, western Carolinas, right? It's the back country. And primarily this is farmland. So people who are moving into the back country tend to be relatively poor farmers, and mainly what they're going to do is they're going to raise grain and livestock. So these are not great plantations. These are small farmers. But what it means is that you are now finding settlers ever further west than you ever did before. And that's a new change as well. All right. Now, in addition to the growth in the backcountry, cities are also growing as you get into the 18th century. So there were already colonial towns, places like Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Charleston, but they really start to grow as you move into the 18th century, mainly because of trade. These are all port cities. They have access in some way, shape, or form to the water. So these are all cities that are becoming large and wealthy based on trade with England. So you have increasingly the growth of cities, and you also in turn have a growing population of people who work for a wage, okay, what we call wage earners. Now remember, in the 18th century, that was not considered a respectable thing to be. In order to be considered an independent citizen, you were supposed to own land. That was what made you independent. So the fact that you had a growing population of wage earners, particularly in the city, people who worked in a carpentry shop, people who worked for a candle maker, whatever, was not actually seen as a good thing. It was actually seen as kind of a bad thing, but it was necessary to the economy. And in turn, you, of course, also have rising poverty. This is the first time you begin to see people who really are classified as poor. And we know this is starting to happen because this is the time period we see the first workhouses. And again, if you've ever read a Charles Dickens novel in your life, you're probably familiar with the idea of the workhouse. In this time period, if you were poor, it was assumed to be your fault. There was something wrong with you. And so you would be imprisoned until you could pay off your debts. And that's what a workhouse did. So it's in really the 1690s, the early 1700s, for the first time we see workhouses. And that's always a sign that in addition to some people starting to do very well, you are also getting people who are doing very, very poorly indeed. And one of the ways we know this is by looking at what today we would call wealth distribution. Again, that's not an 18th century term, that's a modern term, but I think we can use it. So by 1750, half of the wealth of the British North American colonies is in the hands of only 10% of the population. So 10% of the people in the North American colonies control half of the money that there is. So this is very much a growing divide between the wealthy and the poor. Now, the last thing I'm going to say in this lecture to sort of set us up for the next couple lectures is to remember, though, at this point, the American colonies are only one part of a much, much larger British colonial world, right? The British control huge parts of the continent in this time period, not least of which is the Caribbean. Eventually, pretty soon, they're going to be in India as well. So the American colonies are only one part of this much, much larger story. But what's going to, of course, be happening is increasingly you begin to see it playing a larger role in trade and increasingly debating some of these larger issues about exactly where it fits into the British world. So this last slide, again, is just a little reminder to set you up for that. So what we have by the time we get to the early 1700s, the beginning of the 18th century, is we have predominantly southern colonies like Carolina and Virginia and Maryland that are practicing staple crop agriculture. They're growing things like tobacco. They're also where you see most of the wealth concentrated. So the large landowners are the people who are really the wealthiest because they control so much land. So you have the emerging of an elite. They called it the gentry class. And that's important to us for another reason, because it is that gentry class from the South that will produce quite a few of our founding fathers, people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Then you have the northern colonies, New York, New England, Pennsylvania. They're mainly either farming or they're in some kind of trade. But what's increasingly going to be tying this all together is this debate over who gets to be free. What does freedom mean and who ultimately gets it? And that's something we're going to be really exploring in the next lectures.